Hi and welcome to Module 5, everyone. In the last module, we looked at quantitative research, and in this module, we're going to look at qualitative research. You'll recall we talked about this in Module 3 when we looked at Guba and Lincoln's discussion of the differences between qualitative and quantitative. I confess that I'm actually much more comfortable with this module than the last one, as my research has primarily used various qualitative approaches: critical, feminist, interpretive, and so on. However, before we consider qualitative research and what some authors have said about it, I wanted to talk briefly about upcoming assignments. In Module 5, you will once again prepare an annotated bibliography using the same format you used in Module 3 for the first part of this assignment. This time you will annotate 7 articles, only 2 of which may be from a professional journal. In addition to the annotations, you will include a synthesis of the 7 articles as they relate to your potential research topic, which you have already identified in the assignment in Module 2. In this part of the assignment, each of the readings used for your annotated bibliography need to explore some aspect of the topic that you've identified. At least that would be a very helpful way for you to approach it. Since you've already identified and done some of the work around that question, you can follow that up just as you would in quotation marks, a real research project. And then you will synthesize key themes across the 7 readings in relation to your research topic. In addition, there will be a forum in which you will consider a question drawing on themes from the articles assigned. Now, I wanted to note here that there's a video that talks about this particular assignment and the synthesis part of it in particular, and also takes up some of the issues around the assignment in Module 6. Now, you're not going to need to do Module 6 at this point, the assignment in Module 6, but I've just put both of them together so you can read or listen to one, be thinking about that assignment, form your questions that you might have, and you can address them with me or with others, whatever. And then maybe be just kind of having that assignment in Module 6 kind of whirring around in the back of your head a little bit, so that as you see things that might be helpful, you can start gathering that up. So I'm going to put all of that information in the video, and you can have a look at that. Okay, when we think about qualitative research, particularly in education, it doesn't take long to recognize that there are many research questions we might raise. I mean, if we look across those that have been raised in our group alone, we see some important questions that need to be addressed and may have been partially addressed, but there continue to be questions about practices because education is a complex social enterprise. We might be considering questions about phenomena in the practice of individuals, perhaps a student, teacher, principal, vice principal, school board, superintendent, and so on. Or we might explore these questions in various contexts. For example, your research may be exploring a particular phenomena in groups, perhaps the reading practices of minority girls, the work of the parent council, relations between the school and community, and so on. We go on and on. And after we've thought about that question and identified it, we then need to decide the best approach for our research. How can we best answer the question that we're raising? And is it more appropriate to use quantitative or qualitative methodologies? If qualitative, which of the paradigms that Guba and Lincoln talk about, and others, fits our question best? And as we collect data, how can we best organize and analyze it? Well, fortunately, Creswell and Guterman do a masterful job in introducing beginning researchers to the hows of qualitative research: how to organize the research study, different kinds of sampling for qualitative data collection, the sizes of samples, ethical considerations in gaining permission to conduct research, kinds of data, for example, interviews, focus groups, open-ended questionnaires, documents, audiovisual materials, for example, arts-based research using photography, quilts, drama, and so on. So there's such a huge range of ways in which we can think about our research. And then they talk about ways to collect this data so that it is useful and it's ready for analysis. Of course, the way in which we organize data needs careful attention. For example, transcribed interviews can quickly become a large computer file or a binder full of text. For example, in my doctoral work, I interviewed 4 primary participants, all of them equity officers. I interviewed each 3 times, so I had 12 interviews altogether, and I did a focus group with all 4 of them together at once to confirm some of the themes that had emerged. I then interviewed key players that they identified. So, for example, I interviewed a school superintendent, an equity officer, and so on, in each of their various boards. So by the time I did all of that, even though I had, on the surface of it, 4 major participants, the amount of work, the amount of text that was gathered was kind of staggering, actually. Transcripts for the 12 interviews conducted with the primary participants alone filled 1.5 very thick binders. First of all, transcribed onto a computer and then run off so that I could do some analysis. In addition, I had several other transcripts of interviews with key players, documents, historical papers, my own notes, and so on. I didn't use a computer program for my analysis, and I'll talk about some of the reasons why that might be later on. So then how do I go about best organizing all of this data so that I can use it most efficiently and effectively? Creswell and Guterman suggest excellent ideas for keeping track, as well as technical programs that are available and quite useful for analyzing data. However, the learning curve for using these programs is very steep for data analysis software, and the programs are extremely costly. So unless a student is funded or has access to a lab with these programs and the skills to use them, they may choose more low-tech methods, which I did. So these may include coding transcripts with colored pens, cutting and pasting parts of the interviews, and of course you could do this on a computer as well, and put them in different files and discover themes among them and so on, either electronically or with scissors and glue. And I've seen students do it effectively both ways. And I can say from personal experience that this works well. I had one student who actually put everything up on a wall as she pulled together information that seemed to fit some themes that were beginning to emerge, and had this wall covered with clips from the different texts that she had gathered. So whatever method for organizing data is used, the next important question must be answered. How will I analyze and interpret it all? How can I make meaning from such a large body of information? And as usual, Creswell and Guterman give excellent advice that needs to be considered carefully. Patton provides a more philosophical approach to qualitative research. How can a researcher establish quality and credibility for those reading the research and potentially using it to inform educational practices, public policy, and so on, as well as for the participants so they are assured that their voice and contribution has been handled respectfully and credibly? So I'm going to explore those questions briefly in the next slides. There are also 3 excellent videos for you to have a look at. You'll find Creswell's video useful in thinking about the differing but important contributions to research that both qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods can offer. And the Phoenix and Silverwood videos that we see here give excellent examples of qualitative research studies. They're actually really, really interesting. I think you'll find it interesting listening to what they actually researched and how they did it, and the considerations that each of them had to think about when choosing their research method and then conducting their research, organizing their data, and analyzing it. And some of the questions around credibility and so on that they had to answer for themselves and others as they proceeded with that work. Patton goes beyond the hows of research to the whys, as well as the ways in which qualitative researchers can establish credibility for their findings. First, he talks about techniques and methods for establishing the credibility of qualitative research, which includes collecting high-quality data that's carefully analyzed, which Creswell and Guterman take up in detail, of course, and other authors do as well. And he also talks about the importance of paying attention to the validity and reliability of the data and using methods such as triangulation to enrich the findings. For example, in my own research that I've talked about already, I was able to confirm and enrich the themes I identified in the data from the 4 primary participants I talked about earlier by exploring those themes with them, first of all, in individual interviews that built on one another. They got the transcripts back before the next interview of the 3 so that they could go through that transcript and it would refresh their memory. It would also raise other kinds of issues that they might want to bring forward, questions it might raise for them, and so on. So it was kind of like a snowball that it kind of kept moving forward and getting bigger and more complex as we went along. And then we did a focus group, all 4 of the participants together, where I had questions based on the themes that I was beginning to identify, and they then participated in that focus group around answering questions that I had devised. What was interesting to me actually was that we started the focus group with a beginning question, and I just let them run from that point on because they literally answered each of the questions without me saying a word as their discussion proceeded. And that was a way to confirm to me that I was on the right track. I also expanded on what they shared with other key players and verified findings through document searches, member checks that I talked about where they looked through the transcripts and so on, and were able to talk about emerging themes, my notes, and archival information. Patton talks as well about the credibility of the researcher, and this is often a concern for beginning researchers. So that's why you take courses about research, this course and others, among other reasons, of course, to gain credible knowledge about the process in which you are engaged. Experience is an important aspect of credibility, but you can gain experience through practice interviews, for example, or reading deeply about others doing similar work, and so on, so that you lose your self-consciousness about the process and are able to be attentive to the participants and what they are saying to you, as well as the contextual issues that are important while in the research context. And you can make note of that following the interview so that adds to the data that you've collected. Experience for academics comes out of doing the research and presenting it in academic journals, conferences, teacher conference presentations, and so on. And yours will come from doing the research and perhaps presenting it to colleagues, participants, if appropriate. You might want to go back to the school where you've done the research and present some of your findings to them. You might present at school, at teacher conferences and that sort of thing. Or you might put together an article and publish it in your professional journal or in an academic journal. So there are all kinds of ways in which you're actually going to be able to share your findings as well. So your status as a graduate student, how you present yourself, your transparency in presenting your ethics to participants, and transparency about your position in relation to your research. For example, what is your relationship to the work you're doing? And that in qualitative work usually is made very transparent in what you write. All work to establish credibility. Patton also speaks about the importance of your belief in the value of qualitative inquiry and the methods you use for doing qualitative research based on knowledge of its merits. And I'm going to talk about that next. This belief in what you're doing is important because there has been a bias against qualitative research. Not so much now, I would argue, but certainly for many years, as we were having that paradigmatic shift, there was some suspicion around qualitative research. And some continue to feel this way, often those who do not fully understand or appreciate that qualitative research has robust measures of validity and credibility accepted by scholars over a period of time, just like quantitative research does. However, some critiques argue that findings in qualitative work are based on so-called soft data rather than the hard numbers of quantitative research that appear, and I'm doing lots of air quotes here, that appear objective and, air quotes again, factual. Patton argues as well that there is a seductiveness in numbers that makes them preferable in some contexts. And that may be why we see them everywhere now, in presentations at teachers' conferences, in political statements, and so on. But I have argued, along with many other critical scholars, that the seductiveness of numbers has been heightened, particularly within what we would call neoliberal democracies, the kinds of democracies that we're living within now, that impose tight measures of accountability confirmed through measurement. And you see this everywhere in education and in other political entities and business and so on these days. Actions are counted and accounted for using numbers, that is, hard data. We see it in increased use of standardized testing, for example, that is then used to measure a teacher's and schools' educative worthiness. In universities, merit is determined by numbers again, numbers of publications, papers given, teacher scores, etc. Technology can track and enumerate responses to various stimuli on social media, so it's tempting to use it for that very reason. Logarithms established to decide what you are most likely to want to watch, buy, and so on has been made possible through technology. This privileging of hard data for surveillance, control, and the judgment of merit, no matter what the issue or question being addressed, and even whether it's appropriate to do so, has become a dominant ideology that is predominant in North America, the UK, Europe, and other countries. And it's reinforced through world organizations such as the World Bank and so on. And there's a large literature around this whole phenomenon. So we see with the emergence of this ideology, the dependence on numbers increasing. In education, we see this in the power of, for example, the PISA scores. When we compare Swedish students and Japanese students and Fijian students, as though all contexts are equivalent, and judgments are made based on those numerical scores that affect policies and the practices that we engage in our schools and classrooms. For good or not so good, this is what we're doing constantly. So numbers, depending on how they are used, do matter, practically and in policy. Patton argues, however, that whatever kind of research we're doing, we need to be paying attention to the meaningfulness of what we are doing using those methodologies. What is our why? So rather than concentrating on the what of numbers or the what of qualitative methodologies, why are we doing what we're doing? Is it worthy? Is it meaningful? Patton argues that both qualitative and quantitative researchers need to be striving for research that is meaningful in the webs of everyday existence. So while quantitative and qualitative research are different from one another, neither is better or worse, just different. And helpful, both of them helpful, depending on the question being explored. Both have the potential to consider, analyze, and find meaning for others in a wide range of social, political, economic, and cultural contexts. Now, there are some practical issues that Creswell and Guterman consider and that I feel I should point out to you before you, for example, go off and do interviews and that sort of thing. There are a wide range of ways for researchers to approach qualitative research. Interviews are an important approach, but they aren't the only way to collect data. For example, arts-based research can be a very important approach, and it may use photography, for example, with follow-up group discussions or drawings or whatever it happens to be. I recently came across, for example, a very interesting study looking at resiliency within a First Nations community in which young people were given the technology to take pictures that had meaning for them with regard to what made them feel more or less anxious, supported, and so on. Those pictures then, in conversation with the participants, became the focus of meaningful conversations about their relationship to resiliency and support. I could go on, but let's concentrate on some key practicalities. Time and money, the resource question. Time and money are important considerations when developing research design. If you're planning to go to the Yukon to interview a First Nations community about the use of oil or the extraction of oil, for example, that has implications that are significant in terms of your time away, the money that it would cost to do that, and so on. So these are things that need to be considered when you're thinking about how you're going to approach your research. Technology is another one. Often we're using equipment such as digital recorders, video cameras, cameras in general, our phones with, the various things that it can do, and so on. All of that needs to be managed very, very carefully. You need to know what you're doing with it. And I say this from experience because I missed out completely on a video that I was using for a large project that a friend of mine and I were doing together. And I that wasn't something I could reclaim because it was another part of Canada. I had thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. So it's always good to really, practice, and have a backup in case something happens, the lights go out or whatever, so that you can think about how you might approach that. Do a trial run, and this is always very comforting, actually, and it's a good way to trial run your test questions, or to test the questions that you're going to be using in your interviews, to check timing, for example, and so on. It also helps you kind of fine-tune them over time after you've asked a couple of friends who are willing to sit there and let you ask them questions and provide answers. Gives you an opportunity to think about how you think on your feet, how you're going to, what are some corollary questions you might want to ask in response to what they say, and so on. It gives you practice with all of that. In terms of the interview context, set up a quiet, comfortable, preferably unhurried setting for your interviews, which is more easily said than done often, especially if you're interviewing someone who's very busy, like a superintendent or a principal or something like that, where they have lots of people coming and going all of the time. And of course, teachers too, who have students coming and going all the time. So it might be after school, it might be in a different setting, it might be in a different part of the building, and so on. And get that established ahead of time so that you can make sure that your technology is set up adequately as well. And if something happens, somebody, a child breaks their arm and the principal is suddenly either taking them to the hospital or calling in a nurse or whatever it happens to be, you need to be ready for that and perhaps, reschedule and so on. And don't get flustered by that. It's just a part of human interactions. And you know what? Enjoy. Take a deep breath and enjoy the process. There is really nothing that's actually more enjoyable than two people who have a shared concern about a particular issue. You as a researcher, the person that you're researching, you may have different ideas about it, but you both have a shared concern. And it's really quite enjoyable to sit there and talk about these issues together. And it's surprising often that the people that you choose to participate in your studies are really quite thrilled to be, or maybe thrilled is overselling a little bit, but are really happy to be able to share ideas with you and to have their voice heard. So sit back and enjoy. Once you've gone through all of the other steps, enjoy the process of sharing knowledge. Hope that this has been helpful to you. And I welcome your questions about anything that I've said or any part of the module that you have some questions about. Take care.